Welcome to Chapter 6, Sources of International Marketing Data. Welcome to Chapter 6, Sources of International Marketing Data. There are various ways in which we can classify data. We could talk about primary versus secondary, with primary being data that you gather yourself. You could do this through surveys, through interviews, through focus groups, or through ethnographic observations. Secondary data, on the other hand, is data that someone else gathered for another purpose that you're using, usually because it's easier to get to. Quantitative data is numerical data. Things like how many glasses of orange juice does the average French person drink per year versus qualitative data, which answers more the why question. Why do French people drink orange juice or not drink orange juice, as the case may be? There are some obstacles to gathering secondary data, in other words, using data that someone else gathered. This is usually where you will start your research. You'll generally start it online, looking at some resources that we'll view today. The challenge with some of that data is it may or may not be comparable. And by comparable, let me give you an example of that. If I asked you about the folks in the picture, you would probably answer that it looks like a family to you, because in the United States, this is often what families look like. We tend to think of the typical family as mother, father, and children. So if we looked at families in other countries and we had that model in mind, it actually might be rather misleading. In the video clip, you saw the happy bride and groom getting married in Mumbai, India. And I use that as an example because a family in India is not mom and dad and a few kids. A family in India is the mom and dad and the kids, of course. And in addition to that, the father and mother of the groom are part of the family. They will live together until the parents pass away. Another challenge with secondary data is currentness. Situations are changing so rapidly that looking at figures from a few years ago may actually be quite misleading. The last, of course, is the cost. The resources that we'll look at today, for the most part, are free. They're provided by the US government. But when you drill down, a lot of times it's no longer free. You know, case in point, even the Peers database that I'll allude to that's used very, very commonly for international research, there is a cost attached to it. So secondary research generally is less expensive than primary, but it's not always inexpensive. So let's look at primary data. So you can see in the video, which depicts some research being done in India, some of the problems with primary data, specifically the language. This I had to have a translator converting it to Hindi. You can also see some of the other problems with even, logistical things like getting around. The infrastructure is not quite there. And then last but not least, there's the issue of culture. When I was there, people were... So the challenges of collecting primary data, including language, infrastructure, and culture, obviously will vary by country. There are some other challenges with data. One is, what if you're researching a really brand new product? Granted, e-cigarettes are not terribly new in the United States, but in many markets they're unheard of. So there's no way to gather data on past sales because there were no past sales. So in an example like that, you'd use a complementary product or substitution. In this case, it'd be regular cigarettes. Another problem is, what about markets that have been closed for so long, or they're so undeveloped that you really can't get data on those markets? Case in point might be a tiny little country that's rather undeveloped like Lesotho, that the data just really isn't there. So you might find a comparable country, perhaps something like Mauritius, if you think that's close enough to being comparable, that is a matter of debate, and then substitute the data for that country to the country that you're interested in. Other examples of comparing data would be ratio. Case in point, if you're looking at a country like, let's say the United States. In the United States, people the average household gets a new computer about every 5 years. So if you said, well, let's look at another country that's not quite as developed, but almost as developed. This is a hypothetical, let's say Chile. And if the ratio is, they replace 80% as often as the US, you could do the math and figure out how often people in Chile replace their computers. And then last but not least is a timeline comparison. If you were trying to estimate when a country will come online with a product, you might look at a country that had previously adopted the product and see what their timeline was and extrapolate from that. So the easiest way I think, to think about screening a market is to think about it like a funnel. So at the top end of the funnel, it's fairly wide, and a number of potential countries could get in. But as we go further and further down the screening, more and more countries will fall out until ideally we've chosen the best markets. So the first thing to think about is needs potential. If you're selling air conditioning, obviously you're going to look at countries that have a warm climate. The second screening would be financial and economic factors, which answer the question, can they even afford your product? And for that, you would look at things like trends in inflation, exchange rate, interest rates, credit availability. I think I mentioned to you that in the distant past, when I was selling rock crushing plants, those are $100,000 a piece, actually quite a bit more than that now. If credit's not available, folks in a given market can't buy those types of products from you. You'd also probably look at the paying habits of the customers and the return on investment in similar investments. Political and legal factors. Are there entry barriers? Is it difficult to remit your profit? I think we talked about Venezuela making it very, very difficult for firms in that market to remit their profits, to send them back to the home market, to take the money out. And then, of course, there's the obvious factor of political stability. Does it look like there's a regime change on the horizon? Sociocultural factors in some ways can be rather challenging because these are a lot of the qualitative things we talked about and soft data. Generally, it's advisable to hire a consultant with country-specific knowledge. You can get some sociocultural research from publications, from websites. We have a series of books in the library on how to do business in Europe, that breaks it down by country. We also have a book that I have the library order called Do's and Taboos that talks about what to do and not do in various countries. And then competitive forces. It's important to know the number of competitors in your market, their size and financial strength, their market share, and their strategies. And then last but not least, it's absolutely imperative to do a country visit. And you could do that on your own, or you could do that in the context of a government-sponsored event or a trade fair. So let's look at where you might find some of this research. So looking at industry data, one of the best sources of industry data is export.gov. And that has a number of subsections, including market research reports, and then best market reports, where they'll look at a given industry and say, look, we think these are the best markets for that particular product. So let's look at export.gov, and you'll have an opportunity to play around with this a bit on your own. It's a very, very rich resource. So I had mentioned a minute ago that when you do the actual field trip, you could go on a government-sponsored one. And it was nice of them to give us an example of an upcoming trade mission. Okay, so we can see that export.gov is very, very detailed, very rich. Different ways that you can go about looking for data. So we'd mentioned the market research. Let's do market research. Let's take a look at what we've got here. Okay, so you could do opportunities by industry, could do opportunities by country. As I said, it's a fairly rich resource. You'll have a little bit of time to poke around on this and see what might be useful. In terms of trade statistics, oftentimes it's best to look at what a market is currently, especially if you're exporting, what a market is currently importing to see if they are a viable market. A great example of a company that probably didn't do too much of this research on the front end, but chose companies or chose countries in some other fashion is Starbucks.
World, but Starbucks appears to be just discovering the Nordics. John Stoll has been talking to the company's head of European operations. John, Michel Gass sees this as a milestone as far as the company is concerned, heading into those countries.
Yeah, I think that the issue clearly is they're not there. And so anything they can do to drill down into a market where people drink more coffee per capita than anything else in the world is milestone in its very nature. I mean, the question will be execution for this company. They haven't done as well, obviously, in Europe as they've done in Asia and the United States. They're underperforming in the eyes of investors and analysts. So really, their ability to kind of get ramped up in places like Norway, Sweden, and even Finland and Denmark someday is probably a proxy of this company's agility and the legitimacy of a new plan to kind of get the wheels rolling in Europe, where very, very small amount of their profitability is generated, even though they've got a lot of stores.
That's a lot, 8.5% of its revenue. When you think about it, you think Europeans were big coffee drinkers.
Yep. Yeah, indeed. I mean, it's part of the life. I mean, it's part of wherever you go in the world. Obviously, when I went as an American landing in Stockholm, one of the things that was very surprising to me, it's not only a coffee-heavy culture, it's also got a lot of coffee chains and coffee shops. I mean, they definitely embrace the Starbucks model there. In fact, if you were to walk into a place like Wayne's Coffee or Robert's Coffee or the Espresso House, three of their chains, they feel very much like Starbucks. And in some ways, some would argue that they don't have the breadth of a product line that Starbucks does. For instance, if you walk into some of these coffee shops, you won't be offered a dark, medium, or sort of mild roast with somebody who's talking you through the coffees. In some cases, you don't have as educated of a staff and as broad of a product line. So Starbucks can bring something to that market.
What I found astonishing, actually, John, is that the Finns drink as much as the equivalent of 27 pounds of coffee a year. That just sounds like they're swimming in the stuff.
In other words, Finland, Norway, Denmark, and Sweden have huge hot coffee consuming populations, so they do have a need for coffee and represent viable markets. However, before we say that, we'd probably want to drill a little bit further, and coming back to the funnel, let's think about those markets or any markets in terms of economic variables, in terms of political variables, in terms of sociocultural variables, and in terms of competition. So to look at the first three factors, namely economics, politics, and culture, these are some very, very good websites that are discussed at greater length in your book. One kind of quick, not an end point, but a good starting point is the CIA World Factbook. And I believe that we talked about that briefly before, but that will hit at least briefly on all three of the factors that I just mentioned. To drill down further in terms of economic variables, I would encourage you to look at the World Bank economic indicators. Other sources of data that are excellent include the OECD statistics, the country desk officer, of course, of the Department of Commerce. And then Michigan State University has an excellent website out called Global Edge. We had mentioned a minute ago that it's important to look at competitive data. And in fact, they talked in the clip that you just saw about competitors to Starbucks. So here's some resources for that as well. and that it's important to know who's in the market.